So, Coach, I'm a big fan of yours, and I kind of listen to all your podcasts. So, I've been following probably 3 or 4 years. I've only been a coach 5 years.
Well, I'm proud to be one of your mentors, I suppose. I hope I've guided you in the correct direction.
Yeah, of course, definitely. So, first of all, I know you're a great coach, probably all over the world, but here in Taiwan, sports performance are just starting. So can you introduce yourself for the coaches in Taiwan and China?
Oh, sure. My name is Schexnayder. Boo is my nickname, so most people call me Boo Schexnayder. I have been coaching for 42 years. I started off in track and field and American football. After several years coaching in high schools, I moved on to the collegiate ranks and became an effective collegiate track and field coach, and also have coached lots of international level athletes. I've also done a lot of work with other sports and consulting work, working with professional football, professional basketball, professional baseball, and several other sports. And after doing all of this and coaching some Olympic and World Championship medalists, I returned back to work at the university 5 years ago. And as of now, I still work at the university, and I also coach a group of professional track and field athletes.
That was cool. I'm training some track and field athletes right now, and still learn with the coach who also train track and field athletes.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So I know train a lot of different kinds of athlete, but today I kind of want to focus on field athletes, like football or basketball.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's NFL player or NBA players, what would be their in-season training look like if you're
for those sports, because often the competitive season is so long, you have to do a good job in season. You know, in so many Olympic sports, you have a very long preseason period to gain fitness, and that's a tremendous advantage, of course. And if you don't know how to program in season, it's not that big a deal because of the fact that you've done so much preparation in the preseason. But in these types of sports that you're talking about, the preseason training time isn't very long quite often. So you have to be able to not only compete at a high level, but also develop fitness to a high level while the athletes are actually competing. So I think that the mentality of it and the philosophy of it is somewhat different than it is for Olympic sports. What I advise and what I kind of advocate as far as in-season training is a couple of basic philosophies. First of all, in season, as far as the training you consider, the intensity has to stay high. But it's important to understand that the intensity is what we call an aggregate intensity. Aggregate intensity basically means that it's not just about what you do in training being intense, but sometimes the intensity might actually come from the competitions themselves. So you have to look at the competitive schedule, see what type of intensity is coming from the competitive schedule, and train accordingly. So if you're competing very frequently, you might not need to do high intensity training in the actual training environment because of the intensity in the competitions. You might basically decide in that situation to spend more time just doing restoration types of things. On the other hand, if the competitive schedule is not dense, and there are lots of longer breaks in the competitive schedule, then you're going to have to do very high intensity training in the course of the season. So that's the first thing I think you have to do is understand that. You know, I remember one year I had two young men who made Olympic teams. One had a competition every week up until 2 weeks from the Olympic Games, and one had no competitions for 2 months leading up to the Olympic Games. The young man who had a competition every week didn't really need much training because the competitions were his predominant means of training. But the other young man had to train with very high intensities because he didn't have the competition. So we have to understand what an aggregate intensity is. Another key philosophy in season is the idea of the training being polarized. You know, when you're in season, the intensity of the competitions is very high. So if training is going to help or improve your fitness levels, it has to be of very high intensity as well. If training is of low intensity, it's not going to improve the fitness levels if it's not comparable to that of the competitions. Now, at the same time, there may be time and a place for other types of training that's of low intensity, whether it be restoration, or maybe sometimes it's just to keep the human body stimulated in between competitions, or to keep the human body stimulated in between the high intensity sessions. So that's the idea of polarized training. Either you train at a very, very high level of intensity or at a low level of intensity, and you try to stay out of the middle, because the middle is intense enough to fatigue you and make you tired, but the middle is not intense enough to really help produce higher levels of fitness. So if something is not producing high levels of fitness, but is still producing fatigue, then it really needs to be eliminated from the program. And the other third cornerstone, I think, of in-season training is being flexible about when you choose to look at high intensity training. You know, maybe you're looking at the competitive schedule and you feel the need to do some type of high intensity training, whether it be sprinting or high intensity plyometrics or intense weightlifting, whatever the case may be. You know, it's not a good idea to put it or to schedule that type of work indiscriminately. You have to place it in an opportunity where it's safe to do and where the athlete's going to have an opportunity to recover from it. So what I like to do is to hit these very high intensity sessions, understand that because the intensity is high, you don't have to do them very often. Like you might do high intensity work once a week, once every 10 days, sometimes maybe as little as once every 17 days. And then you don't have to be adamant or about exactly what day you find the best opportunity. For example, some of the work that I do with basketball players, when they're doing in season, I have them do high intensity plyometric training. What they'll do is they'll look at their competitive schedule over a course of 17 days. And they'll find an opportunity somewhere in that 17 days. Now, I don't tell them exactly what day to do it. They just know that they need to hit it to do it, but somewhere in that 17-day window. And once they find the safest spot, they do it then. And then they look at the next 17 days. So you have to be flexible in how you do that. The professional baseball players I work with, I'll typically give them some training things and I'll tell them they have to do this, say, once every 7 days or once every 10 days or once every 17 days. But I'm not telling you exactly when they have to do it, you see. So I think that you have to be flexible, particularly with the sports that compete very often. So those three things: understanding aggregate intensities, understanding polarized training, and being flexible in the actual structure of the training. I think those are the three keys to in-season training management. If you understand that and you're quality-based and you're not trying to train high intensity too often, typically you're going to be very successful.
Cool. I heard a lot of times about like the every 17 days on different podcasts you do with Joel, right? Mm-hmm. So why is it like 17 days?
Well, it may not be 17 days. My experience is that it's some types of training, it can be more often. And it depends upon the recovery rates and the intensity of what you're doing. For example, I think Olympic weightlifting, a heavy session, I think you can do that every 6 to 7 days in season very easily. High level plyometrics is more like anywhere from 14 up to 17 days. Speed development type of work is typically anywhere from 10 to 14. So it's just something that I've observed over the years, depending upon the type of training. And it may not be so often for certain types of training.
Okay. So does the max file seem like do something like max sprint?
Quite possibly, yes. I like to see high velocity training in season. Again, not often, but periodically. For example, the baseball players that I work with, what they'll do is I'll have them do 2 or 3 runs where they touch max velocity. And they'll do 3 runs. That's the entire workout on that day, is for them to do 3 run efforts where they touch max velocity. And then they won't do that again for about 14, up to 14, 15, 16 days or so.
So that's all.
Yeah.
That's
exactly.
all about the training session, just 3 runs.
Well, remember, the runs are very high quality. You know, you're going to max velocity. So there's going to be, if you're not ready to do that type of work, you're going to be quite sore from doing that type of work, you know. So it's not acceleration, it's max velocity work. Often when I take these types of athletes that aren't really used to sprinting those types of distances and those types of intensity, it can be quite demanding. I remember one time I had a young lady who came to me for me to coach her. I won't say her name, but she's an elite level long jumper now. She's one of the best long jumpers in the world. And she came to me, and she had a good coach before. And I wrote a workout that she was going to do 3 90-meter sprints, sprint float sprints with a little float zone in the middle. And she looked at it and she laughed. Ha, 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 3 90s. That's nothing. I can handle that easy. Well, she could only do 2 and couldn't finish the remainder of the workout because she did not understand the intensity. She didn't understand that the intensity was going to be like it would be in a competition. You know, the next time, of course, she was ready and she did better. But yeah, sometimes when your listeners listen, they'll think that only 3 runs is not, but it depends on the intensity of the runs, you know. And if you're bringing people to maximal velocity, it's very intense type of work. And that's the philosophy you really need in season. It's not about the amount, it's about the intensity. You know, if you train regularly and you don't sprint very often, when you sprint, you're going to be sore. And that's telling you that the soreness is telling you that the level of tension that the muscles and the connective tissues are experiencing is extremely high. And that kind of tells you why you need to do this type of work. And it prevents injury as well, because all of your injuries are going to be tension related. And the only way to prepare those tissues for high levels of tension is to subject them to high levels of tension in training.
Cool. So next thing I want to talk is about there's some coaches going to talk about like weight training and speed training. So does resistance training interfere with like speed development?
That's a good question. And the answer is it may, and it depends how the two are scheduled and what type of weight training is taking place. I don't think that all strength training, all resistance training is the same. I think that the Olympic lifts like clean, snatch, pulls, those types of lifts, power-based, speed-based types of lifts are very stimulating to the nervous system. So these types of lifts typically support speed training very well. I'm not saying that you would want to do really heavy Olympic lifting right before you do a speed session, but light Olympic lifting before a speed session is something that many coaches do in order to stimulate the athletes for better performance in the speed session. So outside of the immediate fatigue that comes from the heavy workout, I really don't see any problem at all with those types of lifts. Now, there are other types of lifts, though, that I don't care for at all in those situations. For example, and most of those lifts are the heavy, slow types of lifts. Lifts like squat, lifts like deadlift, you know, with heavy weights, low speeds of movement, and those types of exercises. Those types of exercises affect the muscle spindles, the small proprioceptors in the muscle tissue that sense stretch and react to stretch. So when you do those types of exercises, afterward, for some period of time, you're not as coordinated and you're not as elastic as you would be ordinarily. And as a result of that, yes, speed training done after lifting is going to have a negative effect. And if you're indiscriminate and not careful about how you plan the speed training, then it could indeed be a factor there. So that's why I typically I'll do my squat work maybe on a Monday, but I won't do speed development until like the Friday, because that gives the athlete lots of time to recover from that squat work before they have to do that speed development session. Another way that you could do it is you could do the speed before the squat work, you know, because before that fatigue comes in. But so you have to be careful about how you schedule it. So yes, those types of heavy, slow exercises definitely can interfere with speed development if you're not careful. Now, one thing that I do in my program that I believe in, you won't find it written anywhere, is I believe in the existence of what I call proprioceptive supercompensation. What that means is if I take an athlete and I do some of that type of lifting, say like a squat, those proprioceptors become tired. And as a result of that, we lose some coordination, but we lose some elasticity. Well, if I do that on Monday, Tuesday, that athlete's not ready for speed. Wednesday, not ready for speed. Thursday, maybe they're ready for speed. But what I find is that those proprioceptors, not only do they recover, but they actually recover to a point where they're functioning a little bit better. You know, they supercompensate. You know, they at a little bit higher level than they were even before you did the squats. And I find that normally happens several days after. And that's why I like to do squat on Monday and speed development on Friday whenever I can. Because if you don't do any other types of slow lifting in between those two, I find that the athletes are very sharp and ready for speed development on Friday, whereas they are actually sharper and actually more receptive to speed on Friday than if they had not squatted on Monday. On the other hand, if you try to do the speed development on Tuesday or Wednesday, it would be a disaster and it wouldn't go very well at all. So the answer is, depending upon the type of lift, yeah, quite possibly. And especially those heavy slow lifts. So you have to figure out how to schedule them correctly in order for that not to happen.
So you mentioned on squat on Monday and speed development on like Friday. So why I just want to ask, why don't we put speed on Monday and probably squat on Friday, or squat on the other speed first?
Because in most training cultures, Sunday is a day off, you know, so normally the athlete hasn't trained. And in my opinion, speed development does not work well on the day after an off day, because in order to do speed development well, it's not so much about being rested as much about being stimulated. And normally after a weekend off or after a Sunday off, the nervous system's ability to activate muscle tissue is not at its sharpest because of that day off. I'm sure at some point in time, their listeners at some point in time, every one of them has had a long weekend without much exercise and without doing very much, and you feel terrible on Monday, even though you rested the entire weekend. You have a sluggish feeling, you have a stale feeling to you, and that's kind of what goes on with the nervous system. So I would much rather do something stimulating. So what I'll normally do is I'll do something like this. I'll do short acceleration on Monday, I'll do light Olympic lifts on Monday, and then I finish the workout with the squat. And then, you know, we go on through the remainder of the week and do the training. But then the key training at the end of the week is the speed development and high-end plyometric on Friday, because the stimulation is still present. So it's not necessarily the best idea to do true speed development work the day after an off day.
It's kind of like a 3-day road training you mentioned on the other podcast. Like the Monday was like rudimentary. The first day was like rudimentary, like plyo and probably subtract, and increased by, I think the second day or the third day is the max plyo, right? 3 days.
Sometimes with elite athletes, I'll train them in 3-day cycles, where day one is something explosive but safe, and like short accelerations, maybe remedial plyometrics or light Olympic lifts. And the purpose of that day is to stimulate the nervous system and improve the nervous system's ability to activate muscle tissue in the short term. Then the second day is a high intensity speed development, power development type of day, where we're really trying not to stimulate, but to train speed at a very high level. And then the third day is normally some type of restoration type of day, something to enable us to recover and to accelerate restoration after those previous 2 days. And then normally a day off. And if they're ready, that cycle would begin again.
Cool. It's kind of, it's the same philosophy.
Exactly the same philosophy, yeah. And if I was going to do heavy squats in that particular model, I would do it in day 2 after the speed development work.
That's cool.
So there's different ways to arrange things, if you kind of understand what you're trying to accomplish. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. So just finishing that topic and kind of want to jump to like the hip position. How does the hip position affects like sprinting and like jumping?
Well, the hip is the single biggest, most heavily muscled, most powerful joint in the body. It has the most muscles attached to it, and it's capable of producing the most forces. So we're always trying to position the body in order to effectively produce force at the hip. Now, the human body is designed to operate through full ranges of motion and is more efficient when you use big ranges of motion. This is because we are elastic creatures. Elastic energy is important. For example, if you're sprinting, we always tell our sprinters to get their knees up, because if your knees up, what you're doing is you're placing bigger stretches on the hip extensor muscles. The muscles in the back of the leg are being stretched, and they increase the force application when we push down against the ground. But at the same time, when you push down against the ground, the muscles in the front of the leg become stretched. So once again, the hip operates elastically and produces lots of elastic energy if we work through big ranges of motion. So that's the thing to take from, I think, biomechanics as far as sprinting and jumping are concerned, is that the hip produces the majority of the forces. So we want to be hip dominant. And we also need to understand that the hip operates most effectively when it operates through full ranges of motion. Now, we always look at the hip as far as one side of the body, what's that hip doing on the right or on the left? But it's important also to look at the pelvis itself, the whole unit, the pelvic girdle, the bones of the pelvis. Because as you run, when you take a step with your right foot, your right hip is in front of your left. And then you take a step with your left hip's in front of your right. So the pelvis is continuously turning as you run, turning back and forth. And also when your right leg comes up, the right hip is higher than the left. And when the left hip comes up, the left hip is higher than the right. So you also have this up and down movement. So the actual movements of the pelvis, when the pelvis turns one way, stretches certain muscles, and that initiates the movement of the thighs. So the movement of the pelvis and of the hips has a lot to do with feeding energy into the legs. We need to think in terms of the movements of the pelvis producing energy that radiates outward into the body. We should always think of sprinting in terms of originating in the hips and then radiating out so that energy is transferred to the limbs.
So you mentioned like hip dominant. So why does that mean like if we're doing like squats, does the squat need to be like hip dominant, or like should we do something like a hip thruster more, that kind of stuff?
Well, good athletes know how to use their hips. If you look at certain people when they jump, run, even throw, you see that some people plantar flex the ankles dramatically, they're ankle dominant. Some people soften knees and then straighten knees violently, they're knee dominant. But those joints should contribute, but they should be feeding off of the hip. Good athletes fire the hip first, then fire the knee second, and fire the ankle last, because that's the way the human body is designed to best apply forces to the ground, whether you're jumping or whether you're running, or even if you're throwing, that's what the legs do against the ground when you're throwing something. So when I say hip dominant, that's what I mean, that the hips are the joints that initiate the movement as opposed to follow the movement. So that's why when I teach athletes to squat, I like to see them squat deep, particularly in the early stages, because I want the hips involved more. That's why when I have athletes do plyometrics, every once in a while, we try to do deep positions, and we try to make sure that it's not just the knees bending, that the hips are bending as well, again, to make sure that the hips are taking that impact as well. So that's the whole idea of hip dominance, is making sure that athletes know how to use the hips to produce force. And also, when forces are being absorbed, like on the penultimate step of a jump or in a landing from a jump, that it's not only the knees and the ankles that are absorbing the impact, but the hips are absorbing some of the impact as well.
So since we brought up about like sprinting mechanic, so how does like, so there's like a lot of people, like a lot of coaches talk about like front side mechanic and back side mechanic. So how does the front side mechanic or back side mechanic influence the speed development?
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, those are two key terms in sprint coaching these days, you know. And I assume you're talking about maximal velocity sprinting. Okay, so at maximal velocity, if you look at elite level sprinters, when they are sprinting at maximal velocity, and you watch what the foot does, let's assume that you only watch one foot on one side of the body. You would see that foot move up under the hips, you know, real close to under the hip. It moves out in front of the body. It touches down underneath the body. And then when the foot loses contact with the ground, it moves behind. So we actually see the foot in front for a while, and we see the foot behind us for a while, you know, and commonly termed, we call that front side and back side. Now, when you look at really good sprinters at max velocity, again, at max velocity, because acceleration is different, but at max velocity, the distance that the foot extends in front of the body is equal to the distance that we see the foot fall behind the body. So what we basically see is the foot traveling in almost a perfectly circular path. The foot is traveling in a circular path, and the body's long axis, if we drew a line from the shoulder through the hip straight down, half of that circle would be on the front side, half of that circle would be on the back side. Now, that would be perfect. Now, when we look at sprinters who aren't perfect, sometimes we see that circle shifted to the back, and we see athletes who show more backside than front side. That's a fault. That's not effective. Those athletes typically have poor pelvic postures. They have excessive backside mechanics. They fail to achieve sufficient front side. The quadricep muscles are typically not activated when the foot grounds and hits the ground, so you lose force application there as well. So that's a fault. On the other hand, sometimes you see athletes who reach and grab too much. If you look at that circle is shifted to the front. So these athletes really reach out and they grab the ground. They don't touch down underneath themselves. They actually grab out in front of their bodies when they're making contact. And of course, we know that that puts the hamstring in a difficult position, becomes very injury prone in that situation. A lot of plantar flexion, so there's a lot of ankle collapse. So there's a lot of mechanical problems that go along with that as well. So we want to see that symmetry, front side and back side being equal. Now that again is what good sprinting looks like. But it's important to understand, and this is why we hear so much about front side in elite sprint coaching. That's what it looks like, but that's not necessarily what it feels like. Not necessarily what it feels like, okay? So for example, if you and I were out playing in the yard and you're running and I'm gonna throw a ball to you, I can't throw the ball to where you are. I have to throw the ball out in front of you, and then you run to where the ball is going to be, you know? So I have to take into account the distance you travel while the ball is in the air. I have to throw it out in front of you. Well, remember this, when the way the human body works is that from the time an athlete does something to the time the brain can perceive it, the time for that neural signal to travel from that body part to the brain is normally about 1/10 of a second. So there's a time lag involved in that, okay? So very much like I have to aim in front of you in order for you to catch the ball when you're running, the sprinter has to aim in front of them to contact the ground properly, you see? So this is why, even though we look at the video and we see front side and back side, a good sprinter will always tell you when they sprint, they feel front side, but they don't feel back side. You see? So that's the thing to understand, is that the way it looks on the video versus what it feels to the sprinter is different. So in good sprint coaching, you are building your cues and you're building your teaching around not just what the athlete should look like, but also around what the athlete is actually feeling at that time. So because of this 1/10 of a second delay, and because of this need to advance and the need to lead That's why we typically talk about front side in sprinting far, far more. And of course, the faster you are, the more you have to lead. You know, if you're running and I'm going to throw you the ball, if you're slow, I don't throw the ball very far in front of you. But if you're fast, I have to throw the ball much further in front of you. Well, if you're very fast in sprinting, well, then that means that I have to lead more. And that means that the discussion about front side has to be even more pronounced, okay? So that's why you hear so much now in sprint coaching circles about front side mechanics. But but we're never looking for nothing but front side and no backside. You know, we're looking for 50-50 with the understanding that we have to overemphasize the front side in order to get to 50-50. Make sense?
Yeah. So does that mean like at the beginning, the acceleration is like more important?
Not necessarily. I'm not going to say more important, but the ability to efficiently achieve maximal velocity mechanics is affected by how well you accelerate. Of course, acceleration is something entirely different. You know, during acceleration, that is a backside dominant type of activity, you know, so for the first few steps of an acceleration, it's almost all backside. You know, even the foot might be contacting behind the center of mass. You know, I always tell my athletes when they're accelerating, you've never seen a boat with the propeller in front. You always see the boat with the propeller in the back. You know, that's the feeling that you get. And then as the acceleration progresses, you get that sensation of more and more front side until eventually you're looking like 50-50. And that's why when I coach sprinting, a lot of the coaching is based upon foot positions. Like I talk to athletes all the time about when you're accelerating, feel your feet behind you. Or when you're at max velocity, feel your feet in front of you. Of course, that's not really correct, but that's what we say for the reasons that I just gave you a little while ago. You know, and sometimes if they're not accelerating properly, I'll say things like, your feet got in front of you too early. You know, keep your feet behind you longer. You know, you say things like this and give them a general understanding that foot location ultimately kind of is a good cueing system. It's a good way to teach sprinting because athletes kind of feel where their feet are.
Based on what we just discussed, can I program a whole year training, let's say like basketball, on the off season? We're gonna do like strength training and speed development. And let's say we just put it on like squat, heavy lifting on the Monday and speed on the Friday. And when they go to their in season, I gradually decrease the squat and probably just do like Olympic lifting and sprint, or Olympic lifting and max jump, that kind of stuff during the in season. Does that
sounds to me like a perfect plan? You know, once you get in season with basketball athletes jump so much that there's no need to do plyometrics except occasional very intense ones. Like I said, once every 14, 17 days or so. Of course, basketball players, you know, the lifting can be more often. You can hit the high intensity of lifting maybe every 7 days or so. And the max velocity sprints maybe once every 17 days or so. Now, I honestly have a hard time getting basketball players to sprint. And it's not because it's not good for them, it's because it hasn't been a part of their training culture. You know, so many basketball players come and never really sprinted. But if you can get them sprinting, it makes perfect sense as to why they should. You know, so sometimes sport culture just doesn't support the proper training methodologies. And it's a tough job for us as coaches to sell athletes that, yes, this will help. Yes, it's very important. And, you know, it's like sometimes I have a hard time with baseball players understanding why speed development is important and such. But once they see the results, then they're hooked on it. You know, they continue to do it. So to answer your question, it absolutely makes sense. And that's a great philosophy because what you've done in that situation is you have you've you're subjecting that athlete to the high intensity training they need. You're not doing it very often, and you're not doing the lower intensity things like acceleration and lower intensity plyometrics because they're getting so much of that from the basketball themselves. You know, like basketball players are always doing short sprints. They're always doing jumping, so they don't need the lower intensity plyometrics and they don't need the lower intensity shorter sprints. They just need the max velocity and the power and the high intensity plyometric work.
Okay, so we discussed a lot about basketball, but how about like football or like soccer?
Mm-hmm.
When they, I mean, is it the same? Like we train basketball player, or is it different? Because like if it's like NFL, they probably just play a game at one game a week, right? Mm-hmm. How does the programming gonna change?
What was going to change is the fact that they don't play nearly as often means that you're very likely to need some type of stimulation in between. So it's not unlike if these soccer players are regularly changing direction and regularly accelerating in their training, well, then you might not have to do that. But if they're not touching on those things, you'll have to touch on them for stimulation needs. You see, one of the reasons why I don't do like squatting in season with basketball players is because they play multiple times a week. So if they're only playing once a week, that would give you an opportunity to maybe do those types of work once a week and still have the athletes recover in enough time to play in a game on a weekend, you know, so you could maybe do something like that. So it wouldn't really change. One other thing that I do want to mention is that we said basketball players jump a lot, so there's not a lot of need for plyometrics other than some high intensity stuff every once in a while. Well, soccer, you wouldn't consider that to be a jumping sport, but the change of direction in soccer, the demands on the legs are very similar to jumping as well. So if there's a sport like soccer or football that has lots of change of direction, then I tend to treat it like a heavy jumping sport as well. So to answer your question, you know, outside of the need to sprint longer, slightly longer distances, there isn't a huge difference in the way you would program for those two sports.
So can I still like just don't squat during the season? Probably just do
absolutely you can. No, absolutely you can. It's just that every once in a while you come with some athlete who is used to doing that and they're used to doing that and they're the best athlete on the team and they're making the most money of their professional and they make more money than you and you're okay, well go ahead, but if you squat just do it this much, you know. So that those kind of things happen in real life, you know, is sometimes, you know, an athlete comes to you and they're well accomplished and they make lots of money and so forth. And it's more about negotiation and education than it is you're going to do what I say. So that's reality, you know. So, and I've had athletes that are like that. And over the course of time, they eventually, after some period of time, start doing everything I ask them to do. But it might not necessarily be that way at first, you know. So sometimes it's not coaching, sometimes it's negotiation, you know.
Cool. I'm sorry that I didn't follow the program or the list of questions I sent to. I'm trying to make the most of it. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry about it.
But, oh, no, don't apologize. In fact, you're pretty close to it, to be honest with you. Yeah.
So the last thing, and I'm going to let you go, okay?
Okay.
So I know there's a lot of like ACL injury probably when we train like a football, soccer, or like basketball athletes, right?
What kind of injury? ACLs?
Yeah, ACL.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So, or like hamstring, they pull their hamstring a lot. Mm-hmm. So I talk with like different coaches and some of the sprint coach talk to me. They say they're probably going to do like acceleration, like after the physio say they're clear to like go to training, they're probably going to do like sprinting, a little bit of sprinting, probably 2 weeks of acceleration, then they're going to do the strength training. Mm-hmm. So plyo first and then probably strength training. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, I think that those are two very different rehabs, ACL, hamstring. And let's talk about ACL first. I think that joint rehab, like knee, ankle, whatever, are different than soft tissue rehab. So let's talk about the ACL first. When I have an athlete, and I do a lot of ACL rehabs. When I get an athlete for ACL rehab, the first thing I want them to do is I want them to get started jumping. And I understand that sounds crazy, jump somebody with knee injury, but the jumping, of course, is very, very controlled. You might only jump forward maybe 4 or 5 centimeters. You only maybe 1 or 2 centimeters off the ground, very small jump. But the reason why is there are 2 reasons why. First of all, is that eventually everything you do is elastic. So you want elasticity in the rehabilitation from the very first day, from the very start. Secondly, the other reason why is the reason why these athletes were good to begin with is because their nervous system was good at activating muscle tissue. The nervous system doesn't come back from the slow things you do. The nervous system comes back from the faster things you do. So this is why it's important to involve something explosive, even if it's just a little bit explosive, because they'll come back much faster as a result of that. And the third reason why I jump them first is because jumping prepares them for the impact of running. You can control the mechanics of jumping much better. So I typically start ACL people off with very tiny, very small jumps, double leg, that allows the good leg, the uninjured leg, to support the injured leg. And then we progress to single leg. And once they can do that, they start sprinting. And then, and then the strength training comes in and so forth. So that's what I kind of look at first in those situations, is I look for ways to train with very high intensity, the uninjured body parts, and low intensity speed power training for the injured body parts. And it's just about being creative at that point. So that's kind of what I look like. As far as the strength component is concerned, I get them back Olympic lifting very early. I'll have them do light cleans, light snatches from the knees, from the thigh position, I should say, very early in the rehab, because again, it's all about doing things that are explosive. I'm just of the opinion that the reason why joint rehabs typically take so long is because we wait until the joint, the ACL, is healed before we start doing explosive things. And if we would be doing explosive things all along, then everything would progress much, much faster. You see, you can't get strong if the nervous system is not capable of activating muscle tissue. Slow things you do in training do not improve that. Fast things you do in training do improve that. So that's why the training has to be speed-based. Now, going back to your other question about the hamstring injury, to me, soft tissue injuries are a little different. When the injury is in a muscle, muscles have good blood supply. So I don't think you have to do a lot there. In fact, I think a lot of the things that we do to soft tissue injuries slow things down, to be honest with you. Because the muscle tissue has a good blood supply, it typically will heal fairly quickly. But the one thing to understand is that the muscle does not really know how to fix itself. The muscle does not know how to take the collagen, the proteins, and lay them. That message about how to lay the collagens down comes from the usage patterns of the muscle, you see? So here you have a muscle that's torn. You're not doing anything with it. It doesn't know how to fix itself. Then as soon as you start to use it and the muscle feels where the tension is coming from, then it starts to reorganize itself, and that's when you see collagen. So that's why I always say, if you pull a hamstring and you rest for a week, the hamstring's not going to heal in that week that you rested. You have to exercise soft tissue injuries. Now, pain-free, of course. So if I have an athlete with a hamstring injury, what I make them do the first day is I make them run. They might run maybe 10, 40-meter runs or something like that. Now, they might not be fast, and they're below pain threshold, but I make them run nonetheless, even if it's very slow. And then every day it just gets a little faster and a little faster until you're well again. So you really don't have to, and I think that a lot of the things we do, like stretching and manipulation at the injury site, sometimes actually slow the healing down, to be honest with you. The body's trying to lay collagen, and if we interfere with that process through improper manual therapy or stretching or whatever, then it just slows things down, reboosts the whole process.
That's cool. That's really cool, man.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. That was like all the questions I have for today. Really appreciate it.
There'll be another day.
Yeah, I mean, I want to like probably the next few weeks or a few months, I would love to invite you to do a second episode. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. That's like all the questions I have for today. Really appreciate it. And if there's like coaches or like athletes are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
My website is sacspeed.com, SAC for Schexnayder Athletic Consulting, SAC, the word speed.com, SACSPEED.com is my website. Or you can always email me directly, and you can find my email address through that website.
Appreciate it, man.
Thank you very much.